movies explore our fears, our anxieties, the things that we think about but we're not really comfortable saying. For decades, the horror genre has touched on many topics and explored many facets of human life. Horror has always reflected the anxieties of the cultures that it represents. We can trace every decade of horror to the societal fears of the people of that time period. So today, we're going to talk about the long history of gender fear. Specifically when it comes to the representation of trans people, non-binary conforming bodies, and their depiction in horror movies. So we've always had a discomfort with bodies, and more specifically, we've had a discomfort with the bodies of other people, making sure that they don't become what author Julia Kristeva calls the abject. That which does not represent or respect our borders, positions, and rules. That which disturbs identity, system, and order. The abject is at the center of all horror. Our homes aren't supposed to be haunted. Our parents aren't supposed to be killers. We're supposed to be safe in our neighborhoods and when we fall asleep. Dreams can't hurt you. And men are men and women are women. I almost think of this as like a type of body horror. I'll call it other people's body horror. I'll workshop it, never mind. So let's dive in. In this video, we'll talk about abject horror and the abject horror of gender non-conforming bodies in the genre and how it affects our laws, our media, and ultimately how we view ourselves and how we view each other. Florida Republican Governor Ron DeSantis signed into law the quote-unquote Fairness in Women's Sports Act, which bars transgender girls from being allowed to play sports. This bill, which is stripped of its original elements like a mandatory genital examination and genetic testing for schoolgirls, and also to show their birth certificates in order to prove that they were assigned female at birth. This was one in a flurry of ongoing harassment by conservative lawmakers to criminalize transness out of existence. This intrusive, unnecessary, and deeply transphobic law is the most in a recently long line of the history of public fears of gender nonconforming people. But where did this come from? The majority of people in America neither are or know somebody who is trans. Their exposure is entirely limited to the images that they gleam off the TV or in movies. Their whole perception of trans identities are formed from a few episodes of Law & Order and the Hangover movies. So, with so few real-life examples to rely on, they rely on the examples that they see. And what if you see on TV is an inaccurate, problematic, discriminatory depiction? What will your impression be? What if you had to make laws and rules about those people you've never met? What if the only trans representation that you've been exposed to is Michael Caine in Dressed to Kill or pornography? This fear surrounding trans people isn't new, and it stems from a deeply rooted anxiety in society about those who don't conform to our binary understanding of gender and sexuality, those who are others, those who exist outside the acceptable norm and the expectation of others, those who are abject, those who break the rules, those who challenge the boundaries and who deserve the identity of what we all know and are comfortable with. Horror movies within the culture that we see in theaters are a direct relation to our current fears. In the 1930s and 40s, migration was moving upwards, and the fear of the outsider was reflected in the Universal monster movies. In the 1950s and 60s, atomic worries resulted in movies about the invasion and science gone wrong. In the 1970s, had the culture wars and the Manson family crimes that rocked the country, which resulted in more horror movies about home invasions, domestic crimes, and a corrupted Americana. The 1980s existed in the shadow of Reagan, the idea of outsiders invading our nice American white suburbs and harming our beautiful, nice white children. Throughout all of these trends, transphobia never really went away. It flows throughout all of these periods. That's because the fear of the unknown body or unknown person or unknown gender has always been in our imaginations, partly because of really how utterly sex-obsessed we are. particularly in America. Between 1952 and 1955, American service personnel Christine Jorgensen returned from Denmark, having had a full sexual reassignment surgery, where she was featured on the front page of the New York Daily News. This was the first exposure to a trans person that most average Americans had ever had. Christine was an instant tabloid celebrity. She worked as an entertainer, a singer, an actress, and gave lectures on her experience as a transgender woman. The lurid details of her surgery was a constant question in the press. People were vulgarly excited by the curiosity of knowing how it happened. The surgery, although really never fully explained in the media, was drawn out in publications like pulp novels and gossip rags, making it sound as though Jorgensen was the subject to a mad doctor's experimentations. 5 years later, this cultural fascination manifested in a film that congealed the anxieties not only around Jorgensen, but around the graphic, nightmarish horrors of Ed Gein and his suit made of women's bodies. That film being Psycho. The film, directed by Alfred Hitchcock, premiered in 1960 and featured Norman Bates, a shy, awkward boy with an unnatural, close relationship with his mother. It is later discovered that Norman has killed his mother and taken on her personality and dress, killing others as Norma Bates. This film was not actually Hitchcock's first foray into gender-abject villains. That goes to his 1930s film, Murder, in which a cross-dressing trapeze artist frames a young actress for murder. Hitchcock seemed to be particularly interested in this topic. I can only imagine what his hard drive would look like today. But regardless, Ed Gein was arrested in 1957, and by many accounts, he was particularly interested in Christine Jorgensen. Many would look at his interest in Jorgensen and his construction of a suit made of women's skin as a desire to be a woman. His mother was overbearing, and this led to an Oedipus-like obsession with her, referencing Freudian psychology. This led to the killing of women. Notably, what's not blamed is the frequent beatings and violence that he suffered at the hands of his father, or that Gein himself never said that he wanted to be a woman, rather that he wanted to have a woman that could never leave him. This view of women as property and not as individuals is the crux of his killings, but the public was much more horrified in the idea that Gein would want to be a girl. That was his perversion. The success of Psycho led to a rash of copycat movies in the 60s and 70s. 1 year later, William Castle came out with his film Homicidal, in which Jean Arliss plays the murderous Emily and Warren. 1967, Frankenstein Created Woman, where Dr. Frankenstein puts a man's soul inside of a very sexy woman's body. 1971, Dr. Jekyll and Sister Hyde, the story of a mad scientist who invents a serum that turns him into a murderous seductress. Followed by Dario Argento's Four Flies on Grey Velvet, where a woman dresses as a man to torment her husband. All of this is being released during a heightened time of gender and queer uprising and activism. The Stonewall Uprising happened in 1969, and kicked off a wave of trans-led queer activism. This abjection in gender rules sparked much anxiety, particularly from cishet white men, about what people, especially women, do with their bodies. These movies spread the idea that trans people are predatory, liars, seductors, seductresses, who take unwilling men down a path of sexual deviancy and ultimately lead to their death. This resulting in the idea that being transgender is not only tied to trauma, but also to psychopathy. This couldn't be further from the truth, with the estimates from the researchers at the Williams Institute at the University of California, Los Angeles School of Law, reporting that trans people are over 4 times as likely to face violence as their cis counterparts. But that doesn't really matter. Filmmakers who want to exploit the fear of gender abject don't care. The use of trans people as killers moved from the 1970s into the 1980s. I mean, you have to think about it. That's really the only major way that trans people are being depicted in media, is as killers. In 1976, homosexuality was officially removed from the DSM. This can be seen as a reaction to the broader sexual revolution in which more queer people decided to live their lives more openly than before, and the burgeoning queer liberation movement, and ultimately going into the AIDS crisis movement. In 1980, gender identity disorder in children is added to the DSM-3 before being changed to gender dysphoria in children in 2013. 1980 had two films, Terror Train, starring a young Jamie Lee Curtis and David Copperfield, where a group of college students are killed by a magician's assistant who's actually a former male student, and Brian De Palma's infamous Dressed to Kill, where Michael Caine playing Bobby, a transgender woman who kills in order to suppress her male tendencies. In 1981, we have Wes Craven's Deadly Blessing, a movie that somehow involves the Amish, Sharon Stone putting a real spider in her mouth, an incubus, and transphobia for flavor, I guess. I can't really describe the plot of this movie, it's all over the place. 1984's Fatal Games, also known as Olympic Nightmares, which has a transgender nurse who kills athletes because she didn't get into the Olympics over, quote, having too many male hormones. Oddly ahead of its time, that one. 1983 had Sleepaway Camp, probably one of the most popular films of the ones I've listed so far, aside from Psycho and Dressed to Kill. A slasher about teens dying graphically at a summer camp, the killer being assigned male at birth who was forced to live as a girl. The final scene of Angela, the killer, naked holding the head of another person with an uncanny stretched out smile, still chills audiences to this day. 1987 had Strip to Kill, where a man pretends to be his dead sister at a strip club in order to kill other strippers, which is clearly the writer's thinly veiled kink, but go off. This all comes to a head in 1991 with the film Silence of the Lambs. While it's explicitly said in both the book and the movie that Buffalo Bill is not exactly considered to be a trans person by medical professionals, and that trans people are not violent or dangerous people, the abject gender of Bill on camera stands out much more in the imaginations of the audiences. Bill is seen wearing the scalp of a woman, tucking their penis between their legs and trying to simulate a vagina. Bill explicitly wants to become a woman. In Red Dragon, the prequel novel, James Gunn, aka Bill, is directly referred to as trans. She is, quote, 6 foot 1 inch, 205 pounds, has a naturally deep voice. Her chest hair has only been thinned a little by the hormone therapy, and despite her reshaped hairline and lack of beard, she does not look like a woman. In the movie, James is described as being unable to be approved for reassignment surgery because they are, quote, not a real transsexual. But in the books, Grum is denied because she, quote, doesn't pass as a woman. In those times, and really largely even to this day, people didn't get approved for gender reassignment surgery if they didn't live as stereotypical representations of that gender, if you didn't pass. You're not a real transgender woman unless you are petite, feminine, long hair, with a high-pitched voice. That was proof that you were suffering a dysmorphia. But this is medical transphobia. It relies on gender rules from cis people to decide on who and who is not trans. Bill's objection is explicitly tied to their queerness. The film, and its time, had a significant amount of backlash from the LGBTQ community at the time of its release, and laid the foundations for what would later become the ongoing TERF movement, a quote of so-called feminists who do not include trans women in their fight for equality. The bathroom bills of our time owe their legacy to films like Silence of the Lambs, where some right-wing pundits have nicknamed it the, quote, Buffalo Bills. Their ideas formed not by the reality of trans people, but by the false narrative of decades of films. The image of a 6-foot-tall Buffalo Bill type coming into the bathroom with their penis tucked between their legs, thin chest hair, and a deep voice locking the door behind them as your innocent white daughter uses the restroom or the locker room, is what some people see when they vote for these transphobic bills across the country. It's not only inaccurate, but a false caricature based on the fear-mongering of those films and cis fears, cis anxieties around our own bodies. Thankfully, there have been fewer and fewer films like this made in the modern era, with the culture at large moving into a more inclusive and empathetic view of trans people, largely due to the hard work of trans activists and artists. With a few exceptions, like 2011's The Skin I Live In, 2012's The House at the End of the Street, and 2013's Insidious 2, the trope of the angry, violent man stuck in a woman's mind, stuck in a man's body, that trope is dying out, with some queer filmmakers reclaiming transness in horror and placing trans characters in stories that don't make transness their monstrous identities. The continual work by pro-LGBTQ groups, activists, allies, and advocates can't be understated for the change in representation. As culture's idea of what the abject is when it comes to gender changes, so too does the type of movies that we see. Our boundaries of gender are being challenged, and the ways in which even cis people can be defined expands, all thanks to trans people and other gender non-conforming people, because of their bravery to explore their authentic selves outside of a binary. Because of that, we have movies like Hellraiser, Bit, I Saw the TV Glow, Evil Dead Rise, Bad Girl Boogie, T-Blockers, and the upcoming Cuckoo. If you have more movies and more film titles that you would like to share, please let me know in the comments. I have a Letterbox'd, and I would love to know more movies. I have a Letterboxd that has a list of all the films that I referenced for this video, along with further reading and discussions, and also some of the essays that I read and my citations for this video. I hope that you like this video. I haven't made a video in like 4 years, and I'm back now making videos again. I'm very excited. Please hit subscribe if you want to see more video essays like this one, focused on mostly horror, maybe some other things, we'll see. And you know what I'm going to say. If you want videos like this to come out more often, please consider subscribing to my Patreon. The more money that I make on Patreon, the faster I can hire an editor, and the more videos will come out. So I really appreciate you watching. Thank you so much. I hope to see you in the next one. And love yourself, take care of yourself, because at the end of it, we're all a little bit monstrous. Bye.